the story behind the story is I was working for MISA, the Media Institute of Southern Africa at the time, and MISA was a really prominent driver of policy around media freedom and freedom of expression, and then subsequently access to information. And 2009, as we were preparing for the 20th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, the question came up, what is the next issue that we should convene around? And I think that there was, continental consensus that the issue is access to information. And it required a lot of hard work. And as MISA would always do, it was a collaborative organization, and it called on freedom of expression activists and partner organizations throughout the continent, because this would require a continental push. What API, the African Platform on Access to Information Declaration, gives us is an understanding of the right to access to information in all its dimensions as a social, political, economic right. And I think that was groundbreaking, because prior to that, I think a lot of the, let's say, the backlash from governments were as a result of access to information being framed as a journalistic issue. They didn't see it as a developmental issue. And slowly we started changing the narrative around access to information, and that prompted the adoption of so many more laws around access to information. And yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell. Yeah?
Can I add one thing to the backstory?
Yes, of course.
I mean, and it was just that, this is here we felt we could learn from our own experience. But there was another point of pressure, and that is that African governments were passing internet-related legislation, and it wasn't very pleasant legislation. It was legislation that we felt, just as we were beginning to be able to use this medium in our work as journalists and as activists, as social justice activists, they were beginning to restrict it in the way that they were regulating the internet. And that's why we felt we had to intervene sooner rather than later.
I think with both backstories, you get a very good understanding that on the continent, when you are collaborating at that level, you can drive things and drive it to, in a way that really makes impactful, changes to the landscape. And I think that's what comes across. And with that, Henriette, again, I'm going to put you on the thing. Help us to understand the shaping of the 13 principles that inform the declaration.
Thanks very much. Look, it was a collaborative process. We started in 2013 in Nairobi. We launched our initiative. We then started working on drafting, and we had a call for input, a call for priorities. We worked with UNESCO. UNESCO was very helpful as well. We've worked with international organizations and South African organizations. Our first proper drafting workshop was in South Africa, I think, in Johannesburg. And as Zoe said, we started by workshopping what are the issues. But I think obviously we used as a framework international human rights agreements. We used the African Charter as a basis. But we also used what we felt in a way, we gave ourselves the freedom as well to start from a clean slate, So we looked at something like language diversity in Africa. It's extremely important for us, and yet you don't really see that reflected in most human rights instruments. So it really was, I think it was a case of bringing a mix of people into the room and then workshopping the issues, looking at existing rights agreements and filling gaps. And also the structure of the declaration, if those of you can look at it, it has principles and then it has the application of these principles. And we felt that was important. But I'll tell one little anecdote, because we being the Africans, really wanted to put in freedom of association. as a right. Now, at that time, the international human rights institutions had already discussed freedom of expression on the internet at length. They had not discussed freedom of association. And Article 19, which was one of our global partners, just blank point, they refused. They said there's no precedent. Freedom of association is not a right that expresses itself digitally. You know, and we kind of said, yes, that's because you all work in London and you take the tube when you have meetings. We can't do that. We can't meet if we don't meet online. And we had to really fight against the international experts. And we put freedom of association in here. And at about, 2-3 years later, the Human Rights Council recognized freedom of association. So I think that's in a way where we were also quite revolutionary, I think. And I think that's the thing that you do when you actually start looking at rights through your local experience and reality. You sometimes discover things which the international community hasn't discovered yet. And I think AfDec is a little bit like that.
Okay. Then Isaac, I'll come across to you. How do you think, especially around freedom of expression and access to information, frameworks on the continent have, influenced the declaration and contribute and complement the declaration? Sorry, we're trying to do the technical stuff here. Perfect, thanks.
So there was an interesting sequence of events, right? So you had in 2011, 2012, APAI, and this declaration following in 2014. But before that, in 2013, the African Commission on Human People's Rights published the model law on access to information. Yes. Without a single reference to the internet, right? So I'm not sure, I wasn't involved in the AfDec discussions at that time, but I'm sure that was, there was a need to extend the principles in the model law. So following on that, the African Commission, when it then looked at how can they come up with ways to, apart from assisting governments to implement their own access to information legislation, what else could they do to promote access to information in different spheres? They then started a process that resulted in 2017 in the Guidelines on Access to Information and Elections, with a few references to the internet, but not a lot. But what's quite important, though, is that the principle of proactive disclosure, which is actually in the model law,
Yes, sir.
became part and parcel of the electoral guidelines. And if you look at how the model law was then applied to the elections and some of the key principles like proactive disclosure, transparency in record management, obligations of digital record management, those kinds of issues. They're quite important in whichever area you apply the principles in the model law. But by then, there was now a gap here. So what about access to information, model law, and the internet? So the next project that the African Commission then launched was what resulted in the 2019 Declaration on the Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. What, Henriette?
You know why they launched that project?
Please tell us first.
Sorry to do this, but I think this is important. So I talked a bit about why AfDec was drafted, but once it was drafted, we had a strategy, and I think Media Foundation hosted a meeting in Accra, and really our primary advocacy goal was to get the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to recognize the internet as an enabler of freedom of expression. So that was our first goal. And and we worked very hard with that. We were very lucky at the time. Pansy Tlakula was the chair and the rapporteur on freedom of expression of the Commission in Banjul. And in 2016, we got a resolution that quoted AfDec and cited AfDec, and that instructed the Commission to start that project of revising the Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression. So it is a chain of events, actually. And I think the reason that was important for us, and Isak must pick up on this again, is because just having a booklet or a website with the rights was not really what we wanted. We wanted a framework that African activists and journalists could use to hold governments accountable, to use as a checklist. We wanted to be able to also use the universal periodic review process of the Human Rights Council. So we wanted something that Africans would use to start assessing their local environments from an internet-related human rights perspective. And that's why that step that Isak has just, but that he was part of the drafting as well, was so important. That was our goal, actually. And I think to some extent, maybe also where we achieved that goal, and then I think we were not necessarily efficient enough in crafting a new goal.
And so the vehicle then was that the African Commission decided on was to update, after those resolutions, was to update the 2001 2002 Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression. So what resulted in, so the initial declaration covered two main areas. Generally, freedom of expression. Secondly, media freedom. That was the scope of that. In the new updated declaration, it added two sections. One on access to information, taking the principles in the model law, but building a bit further on that and making some of the obligations much stronger than what's in the model law. And secondly, it became the first instrument on access to the internet rights. I would call it digital rights. The heading in it is slightly different, but it's the same thing. And that was a really interesting experience. I remember the group of us sitting around the table, and if that person speaks, you know this is an AfDec person, and that person is an AfDec person. And so, without saying, let's look at AfDec and put it in here. In fact, all the principles from AfDec, one after the other, got incorporated. And it just shows the power of that initial 2014 effort and the result that it can have.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Looking forward, though, and I'll come back later. I just want to make this point quickly. So with a model law, it encouraged many countries. I think we're now standing, about 25, 26 countries, either with access to information laws, 29, thank you, wow, or in the process of getting it. The problem, though, with that is because much of that legislation is based on the model law, and the model law hasn't got a single reference to the internet.
Yeah.
Countries, access to information laws now don't take into account the online access to information. The declaration that I spoke about, however, has the section on it. Now, if you put together the model law and the section on access to the internet and internet rights, then you have a good basis to come up with access to information legislation that's fit for purpose in the digital age. Now, currently, there's no such guidelines existing, and that's the challenge.
No, thanks for raising that point.
And I disagree, so maybe you should give an opportunity.
No, thanks for raising that point. We'll park it and we'll bring it up as one of the, steps forward when we do discuss it. I think it's, by the way, as I was listening to the story, I was like thinking, there's so much institutional memory and it's sitting here and a few people in the audience there. Somewhere you've got to start documenting these things. And especially because I don't think that we realize how much this continent drives frameworks, policies, and contributes to the global agenda around rights, freedom of expression. Access to information is purely driven by by African activists. I can tell you that with conviction. You know, I've watched that. So, yeah. Koliwe, you're doing some research. You've been commissioned, and by the way, sorry, and then another thing that I wanted to add, there was a consultative process around the revision of the Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression, and Southern Africa was not part of that discussion. And then the Namibia Media Trust convened that, Zoe and team, convened that meeting in Windhoek, and that is where, yeah, and that is where a great deal of the contribution around digital rights was made. Yeah? Am I correct? Yeah.
We were just saying, stop stealing my thunder.
Sorry. Anyway, Koliwe, a decade later, what has been the impact of the Declaration on the continent? And do you think that advocates are using it as an advocacy and lobbying tool as envisaged by the drafting committee?
Thanks for that question. It just feels really weird sitting with Isaac and Zoe and everyone else. It's a trick question because I think that the things that Andriette and Isaac just mentioned now actually demonstrate the impact of the declaration.
Yeah.
But I think what has been key for me as I've just been looking at the work that's been done is the fact that it's actually stood the test of time. So whereas you don't find the word AI, you find the word internet. Where you expect to find innovation, you'll find the word technology. But I think what has been amazing about the declaration is the sections on application. So if you have a copy of the declaration, you'll find that underneath the description of each principle, you will get how you can, translate it within your own context. And I think I was privileged to be coordinating the coalition during COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing how, with all the fake news, misinformation laws, we were able to pick up certain aspects of the declaration, whether it was access to information, whether it was freedom of expression, whether it was also just privacy issues. And I think that one of the things that Isaac didn't mention around the revision of the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information was that even though the African Charter didn't have privacy as a right, we were seeing it so vividly. And I think for me, one of the things that I have been thinking about seriously, even as I've been doing the research, is that we need to press on and heighten the issues around privacy, particularly that within the continent, AI, as we speak about AI, is being adopted even by our public institutions to provide public services to us. But people still don't have an understanding of the fact that as you use the internet, you're feeding into a system and you're teaching it to interpret issues. There are biases that will continue to exist, an imprinting of inequalities, whether it's, I think earlier we were talking about, how within the African context, the LGBT community is still very marginalized. But how easy is it for a government institute to be able to access or sift out or sniff out particular individuals that we see as vulnerable? And then the second thing for me, Rihanna, is also looking at the number of people who were part of the process. I think even just reading, back and trying to find when did we start talking about digital rights? So when you think about the declaration, you're going to think about the document. But I like to think of AfDec as well as a movement, because I think once that declaration was available to people, we saw a lot of mushrooming of networks within sub-regions in the continent. We started seeing pressure groups in individual countries. People had a reference to sort of use to say, this is the standard. So I think by setting standards that have stood the test of time, there's a lot of, I think we owe a lot to the people who actually sat and crafted it, because sometimes you have documents that become redundant. And I think what makes the declaration special as well is that there's a basis. So you're looking at even the media and freedom of expression documents that already exist that had standards like the Windhoek Declaration. You can actually see issues to do with freedom of expression from a citizen's perspective, but also from the media perspective, and also in terms of just accessing information.
Thank you. Thanks, Koliwe. Anyone had any? Yes.
I think if you've been working in civil society, you know that your reality within the process of policy making involves politicians. It also requires that you have a media that actually understands and can, build the pressure within the ordinary citizens to understand that there's a certain law that's coming up, and the current issues in the draft are A, B, C, D. But remember that the same act will always go back to Parliament, and sometimes legislators themselves have a hard time actually understanding the policies themselves. So sometimes it takes longer, especially if that law is actually going to be passed. That's how you find, even as it's being implemented, people are still making challenges in the court. So I wouldn't say that we've done anything wrong, or we've gone in a direction that we shouldn't have been taking. I think it's understanding. I think a few years ago, Anrit was telling us about power mapping when I went to the school on internet governance. It's being very clear who holds the power, how much influence you have in bringing in certain positions, standards, or, just the ideals within the law, and then being able to, find a way of getting people who would influence that particular clause, whether it's a clause in the law, to be able to, realize the need to change it. So I worked in the media in Zimbabwe for, I think, 15 years, and we were fighting for an access to information law. But it took me leaving 15 years later for us to actually have the law. But can we say we failed? No. I think people always build on what has been done by their predecessors, but it's also political will and how many of us are actually able to pick up and continue to push.
And before anyone else comes in, I think Zoe and I always talk about this, that when you decide to do any kind of advocacy around policy reform, know that it's a long road. It just is. You may not even see the results of it in your working career. Think about, ATI, the amendments, the revisions. It's decades of work. Yeah. So I don't think it's about, and also remember, the agenda of governments is very different to that of civil society and the rights that they are trying to push through. So it's not about doing wrong, it's about how they then tailor legislation to serve their interests. I think Henriette, and then is Zoe as well. And
just to respond to that, I think. Well, remember the declaration is not a legal instrument. It's a network building. It's a tool to help people analyze draft legislation. But there's nothing in the declaration that isn't an interpretation of international law, of international human rights law, which our governments are signatories to. The big treaties, the Treaty on Civil and Political Rights, and the Treaty on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the treaties on the rights of the child. So all of these, African governments are usually very happy to sign international treaties. They're not so happy to comply with them. I think and then if you look at the African instruments as well, the African Commission and the African Charter. By the way, Koliwe, we did manage to get privacy in through the Declaration of Principles in 2019. I think we don't use that. And I think, as Koliwe said, our legislatures don't use that. But ultimately what they do need to do, in an ideal sort of chain of policy making, you would have international human rights and access to information guidelines. Those are domesticated at a national level. They reflect it in your national constitution or your Bill of Rights, if you have that. You have a Human Rights Commission, you have a National Human Rights Institution whose job it is to review draft legislation and make sure that any legislation doesn't contradict any of the international treaties that particular government is a signatory to. But that doesn't happen, as Koliwe said. And I think what we try to do with AfriSig is to remind people that has to happen, not with AfriSig, with the African Declaration, and to give them a tool that is a user-friendly tool to do that. And I think we're still in exactly the same place. There are good stories in Nigeria. Paradigm Initiative and others, Media Rights Agenda, used the declaration to send some cybersecurity legislation back to Parliament or to the drafters. But I think it's a complex thing, and I think, as Rihanna said, it takes a long time. But I think also what happens in Africa is that so much of our rights advocacy is perceived by our governments as being driven by global north agendas, by foreign funders, by foreign policy agendas that exploit civil society. There's a lot of suspicion from our governments of digital rights advocacy, of human rights advocacy in general. And I think we need to think about what strategy and tactics do we employ. And I think AfDec was an attempt to try and cut through that kind of prejudice by building an indigenous, African digital rights movement. And I think we've kind of lost a bit of that impetus. I think we have a lot of digital rights advocacy, much more than there was when we started, but I think it's quite fragmented, and it's often implemented by African institutions, but designed by international NGOs.
Yeah, you can keep the microphone. Actually, I'm going to move on to another question, which I think follows on very well from here. One of it'll start with you, Zoe. How do we talked about this, that, we had a PI working group, and now it kind of has, fractured a little bit. How do we keep momentum going, especially around, the declaration, around, the model, the principles on freedom of expression, these policy frameworks, because we have to keep, our vision doesn't stop with it coming into, policy form. It has to go beyond that. How do we keep that momentum? Especially because these are networks and, collaborative efforts.
Sure, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Maintaining the momentum. I think that that's a challenge for civil society organizations. Also because one of the challenges that we find within civil society is development of knowledge, development of capacity. Civil society is a builder of capacity in many instances, and we continually lose talent to other organizations and institutions. But I think in civil society, if you are really committed to the cause, you are always consistently looking for innovative ways to push that human rights agenda. And that's why 2019, I remember us sitting in Windhoek, and you were saying that you could see that's an AfDec person, that's an AfDec person. I could see that's an API person. So there are common interests, and that's why networks and coalition building is so incredibly important.
Thank you so much for the reflection. But I think on keeping it alive, I wanted to just throw it back to the panel about, this is knowledge that is resident. It's specialist knowledge resident in like a particular group of people. So the issue of popularizing the declaration, it's still maybe not as well known in all countries. But how do we do this, especially bringing in younger people as well, to be interested in policy work and passing the baton also. Is this something that the panelists are thinking also about, so that we bring in people who are interested in TikTok. How does this speak to TikTok data privacy and so forth? And then that will keep the momentum and interest younger people to come and build on this knowledge. Otherwise, if we are gone, then all of this is also gone. All this historical
most
work.
definitely.
Yeah.
I think actually we can start with Isaac because he has been working on the continent. Koliwe is one of the people who was actually, showed you.
Can I propose a question?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the excellent reflection. I think, I don't know who mentioned that, but there was, I think one of the panelists, or was it you, Rihanna, who said the agenda of government most of the times is different from the agenda of civil society. Shouldn't there be one agenda, but driven by different players from, different angles, so that's a two-pronged approach to one common issue that needs to be addressed? Because the moment we start seeing each other as foes, government versus civil society, that is very problematic. And I think this is a very enduring issue in most African societies, or in where we do our work, that civil society is perceived from the get-go that you are an adversary of government, of which we are not supposed to be.
Yeah.
We are partners, but we just have different entry points driving towards one important goal. So should we even continue this narrative saying that the agenda of government is different from the agenda of civil society? I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can start. Before we hand it over to anyone, since I am moderating the session, I do. I think before you answer the question, the one thing that I think the panelists may not sort of say to you is that if I've learned something, because I was chairperson at MISA and we used to work around a lot of the rights issues and we were very adversarial. But people like Henry Miner, Suleimana, Zoe, Anuet, all of them always talked about you engaged rather than oppose, and you get much further. Yeah. And that is something that, we've seen being very successful, especially around the principles on freedom of expression and access to information, on the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms. It has been a process where it's been engaging with policymakers at government level. But you can continue responding.
So, and I think the African Commission should give credit for the way in which they welcome participation of civil society. In fact, to put it the other way around, we would not have had a declaration if it wasn't for civil society. It would not have happened. As Henriette explained, the initial resolutions for the African Commission to do something came from civil society. Then there was another resolution later to bring some of the different issues together on access to information and online rights, also initiated by civil society. And then what happened? For the special rapporteur at the time to actually draft it, they 100% relied on civil society. So it was a civil society driven, the only person from the African Commission was the special rapporteur, right? Yeah. And in those discussions, we would come up with radical proposals. And then the response from the special rapporteur was, while I agree with you, let's see what language we can use so that I can convince my colleagues on the African Commission. So, I mean, it was that kind of thing. Yeah, and it was really a good experience to have. Now, I want to say something on the issue of how we take some of these things forward, right? In the two processes that I was involved in, one, the election guidelines and the declaration, we made sure that the last clauses puts an obligation on governments to report on progress on implementation. That's the most important thing in those documents. But it now puts an obligation not on necessarily continental movements like AfDec and others, but on civil society players in each country to first try and make sure that their governments actually report on it. and try to work with them in helping governments to report on it. And if that doesn't work, there's scope to produce shadow reports and submit it to the Commission. I don't think there's been really an effort by any African government up to now. None of them have committed to the obligation to report on progress. There's a big gap for civil society to actually get in. And Telda, on your question, maybe we should, so I invited somebody into this meeting who I hope will be part of the next generation. Sorry. And I wanted to say something.
And as the moderator, I'll allow you to do it, only because you kind of went ahead and did it. Yeah, it should be. I do want to remind you that I'm here, but anyway, I'll allow it.
Hi, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Thank you very much, Isak, and thank you for the invite. I have met some of these great people on the panel, and oh my goodness, such institutional memories, amazing. And I think just to answer the question about how this movement can be taken forward, let me also just introduce myself. I work for SOS Coalition, which is an advocacy group that advocates for an effective public broadcaster in South Africa. So, and I think if it wasn't for Isak being part of the group, we wouldn't have known about the declaration. So I think there is a gap where you could partner with various civil society organizations, keep track of policy processes and legislative developments where there are, organizations that are already advocating with government, and partner with them, have a discussion with them, help them understand how this declaration can be used in their various lines of work. Because I think that way you are able to work through civil society organizations that already have a reputation, but at the same time, there is an understanding of the impact of digital rights on various, sectors. Because I think the one thing about digital rights, it cuts across various sectors. So that would give you an opportunity to really, really just, maximize your impact.
Thank you. You can just hand it to Gwen.
Thanks.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you have actually.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Just a few really quite random thoughts around this. Sort of also capitalizing on what Telda has said and Dixon. It seems to me the dilemma is as follows. We all these human rights activists working in these various areas of media freedom,
yes,
freedom of expression, access to information, and so on. Our main task usually is with this kind of thing is to convince governments, right? Not to legislate outside of the ambit of human rights. But there's a very important constituency that I think civil society sometimes forgets, and that's the people themselves.
Yeah.
And maybe to be more specific, the youth. Very critical these days. As I say, it goes to what she's just said. It's one thing to convince governments to have an ATI law that is compliant with all the things we believe it should be. I remember back in the day, and Zoe will recall, with the whole, when we had the movement to get an ATI law in Namibia, with a group called Access to Information Group there. And I would sit there sometimes very conflicted. And I would say, why are we fighting for access to information laws? Why don't we just insist on no secrecy in government? Why are we asking for laws which at the end of the day we will spend years and decades sometimes campaigning for, only at the end of the day to have governments put in this and put in national security and put in information commissioners who are appointed by government, and the obstacles will kind of just slowly be inserted to actually free up information. So I often felt very conflicted about that, but besides that, I was fully committed to the campaign. But again, it's early days yet in Namibia with our ATI law. We're still waiting. It's been passed. We're waiting for the appointment of a commissioner, but we can see, if we are really looking around, that the obstacles are there and that they're going to happen. And it could be another decade before this is even put to the test. So I think it is really very important that civil society needs, instead of going after government recognition a lot of the time, to first popularize or try to popularize these campaigns, access to information, amendments to the rights and freedoms and so on, to speak to the people themselves, to get their buy-in. How do you get the message across to youth that what we are doing is important for them and their Facebook presence? Because that's really, at the end of the day, what they really care about. If you tell them you're going to lose your social media presence if XYZ doesn't happen, there are ways you need to, and you can get through to them. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge. And we've had this in Namibia with ATI as well. Unless the people buy in to needing and wanting access to information and realizing the importance in their lives, we're going to continually battle with having these great things and these great instruments, but they just don't have popular resonance, I think, right?
Sorry, it's over there.
Yeah, thank you.
You want this one? Let's just do a swap.
Thank you. I think I was, like, you picked it off what I was thinking. Because I wanted to say, despite, this very great document and what it really could deliver to people in terms of protecting their rights, what we see, a pattern that has been consistent, for example, in Nigeria, is that the civic space continues to shrink in a way that is very scary. I don't know if anyone followed what happened during the NSAS protest, where lots of people were killed. There were investigative reports that showed that people were killed, and as we speak, the government continues to deny that happened. And then this year again, we had the End Bad Governance protest. At my organization, for example, we track incidents of attacks against journalists, and I can tell that even within that space of, I think about a week, about 67 journalists were physically attacked. And that's not to speak about citizens that were, brutalized, that were impacted. And then you see how the digital space, even though it has, propelled the work that journalists do, but in some way exposes them to a lot of very grave danger. Surveillance is big, so people can just track your footprint and then you get picked up. And then there is the cybercrime, law, which is, recent, not recent in Nigeria, but there's a new dimension to that, even though that law has now been amended. But this year alone, we've had 11 journalists either abducted and held incommunicado, all in the name of cyber stalking. Yeah. So I am also for really putting people, at the front line of the advocacy, not to just make this about protecting the civic space, because again, when you say civic space like that, it's like we against them kind of thing. People do not see that, this civic space is about us, so they don't buy into that advocacy. And then, so it's a solo voice, just a few people working in silo. And then to also just ask, I don't know how you're thinking about that. Is there a way for us to leverage these documents that we have, and some other rights, some other declarations that we have, to force, I do not want to say accountability, even though that's the word that is coming to my head, but some form of compliance, on the side of the government? Because we could say, engage, not confront, but you can only engage with somebody who wants to engage with you. I wouldn't say the mindset that the government, for example, in Nigeria has as of now is that of engagement. So, the civic society is just seen from that adversarial lens, and it's like a battle line is drawn. So how are we thinking about, whether you want to, we are willing to engage, but if you do not want to engage, there is this window for the people, for the civic space, for journalists to force compliance. How are we thinking
you.
about that?
Yeah. So, yes, I know you guys all are very keen on moderating the session, but I know Rashwet has a question. I just want to put to you that we have another session. I'm encroaching on Peace's time. Okay. So, Rashwet, very short and sweet, and then I'm going to wind up here, if that's okay.
Thanks, Rihanna. Not so much of a question, but a contribution that first we must applaud ourselves for keeping these issues on the agenda, that we have laid a foundation for maintaining the dialogue and, of course, incorporating the changes in our communication spaces, issues around digital rights, but also to accept that the sector has drifted significantly and that there is need for inclusion of other groups and stakeholders, some of whom will never be part of these kind of conferences, who may not even be comfortable being here, your telecom sector and others. So I think we need to look at a much broader, inclusive sort of participation by other groups that are influential but lacking the platforms for engagement. Then the other issue, of course, which Gwen mentioned, is for us to be very practical in terms of what these issues mean to the lives of Africans. If we read the latest Afrobarometer governance perception, it clearly indicates that Africans are shifting away from accepting democracy, because they are thinking that it's not serving their interests. They are concerned about water, health, and all those kind of things. And at a global level, there has been a huge shift or pushback against a liberal democracy. And the question is, how do we speak about these issues from a people-centered perspective? And ensure that we are not speaking in or acting in abstract terms, but we are actually addressing issues that are affecting our communities. Thank you, Rihanna.
Actually, Rashid, that was fantastic, because the question I'm going to ask is, how do we ensure that the declaration remains relevant, speaks to our African realities, and how do we reshape it? Koliwe, I'll start with you because I know.
What?
I know you said it stood the test of time, but
sorry, what was the question?
The question is, how do we ensure that this declaration remains relevant, that it speaks to the lived realities, okay? Yeah. And do we need to reshape it? You're saying it stands the test of time, but with technological advances, I think, we might have to relook at that.
Yeah, I think that the most important question, until that this goes to you, is we don't even know what's in our constitution. Like, we don't know which section in the constitution speaks to my right as a woman. So my very controversial response is, citizens don't have to know the declaration, the document, but we as civil society, and I wanted to prefix, civil society is not, my favorite word, homogeneous. We've got community-based organizations. So one of the things that I do at Mozilla every time I have a grant is I will make sure that those funds are not going to the usual suspects. So I'm not going to give NMT. I'm going to give a women's group. But then there's a challenge that comes with that in that they will still need support in terms of them being able to administer the funds, but also in terms of the support that you get. So I think when you look at issues like the internet shutdowns, especially the Nigeria case with the closure of Twitter, and the way that citizens responded to something that was familiar to them. So the big question and challenge is, how do we actually apply as the media, as civil society, when we issue statements, when we're having conversations in community-based in community meetings, maybe in the town hall, and be able to make that application. And how do we as civil society, I think the word you said was, it's a very technical conversation that we're having. So how do we make it less technical? And for the recent African commissions that the sessions that I've been attending, I've noticed that there's actually even been a shift on the people who are actually reporting on human rights in respect of different communities. So how are we touching base and how are we coming together also as civil society, acknowledging that there are some people that will probably have the reporting status when we don't? How are we taking the issues to them? And then your question on what is it that we need to change? I think that, and I wrote this down, sorry, I'm going to have to do this. I think there needs to be a specific attention that's going to be paid to AI and algorithmic decision making. So looking at the reality of using the systems and what it actually means. And I think that there are several principles within the declaration that are actually speaking to different issues around injustices, but I think a specific clause that's looking at that would be very important. Then the second thing for me is human agency. And there was a panel this morning that spoke about, do people actually know where their data is stored and how it's going to be used? And we also need to be very clear also about accountability, and I'm making it short, by the actual tech players. And I think it's already there within the declaration, but there are specific issues around ethics and the policies that the technical players themselves, the technical companies, need to be looking at or that we need to be pushing. And then I think the last thing I have is on ethics. I think this is the same thing, ethics by design, just making sure that we're more clearer about the obligations of the tech companies when they are designing, looking at issues around risk assessment, being able to touch base with the actual users themselves. And then I think that because when you're looking at the framework like the African Declaration, as Andrea said, it's not binding. But I think it gives us a basis to then model or look at, for instance, I know there's an interesting research that's recently been done about a maternal health app in Zambia, the Dawa Mom. I don't know if there are people from Zambia that are here, where you're looking at the inefficiencies, but going back to the actual women whose records are being stored in that particular system. So it's applying and making sure that we have clarity on what it is that we're going to be making demands on the actual tech companies with the reality of machine learning and AI, and people actually being able to say, we would like to, have access to the data. And also in terms of just accountability for me is, at what point and to what extent, especially for journalists that are here, at what point do we make demands for information, especially when it is like public, a public system? And I think that we need to be also very deliberate if we're considering updating the declaration, to also acknowledge that there's actually been a shift in governments using AI systems. We're being surveilled all the time when we're going through immigration, and we need to actually ensure that the application clauses within the declaration are very specific so that people know how to apply them.
Thank you.
Last bit. With your permission, moderator. I might actually even disagree a little bit with Connie. No, I think,
a good thing.
I think really, I think thanks for all the responses. It's really not about the declaration. It's about what it represents. And it's about how we use it. And I'm not convinced that it's worth updating it. I think it's worth applying it. And I think, as you say, reinterpreting, applying it to emerging challenges and context. I think we have a tendency in civil society and in social movements to build our movements through drafting text together. It's a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful network building and collaboration building tool. But the trick is to keep the collaboration going after you've completed, the drafting process. I think AfDec, there are so many digital rights activists in Africa now, many more than there were when we started. I don't think they exist because of AfDec. I think some of them might have been influenced or had access to AfDec. I think they exist because they need to exist, because if you're working in civil society, if you're working in expression in the media, you need to advocate for digital rights because you don't really have them. So for me, it's really a question about strategy and tactics. Does the African Declaration add something to how we work towards our goals that can make us stronger, make us more effective? So that's the question for me. That's for me a more important question than whether we should update it or not. I think we have fundamental human rights, laws and principles. We don't need to update them. We just need to apply them. I think that the other issue, the issue about younger people, I think there are lots of young people engaged in this space. I think the challenge of being more effective and more strategic is an intergenerational challenge. I think we all need to think about how we work together more effectively. And I think it's not easy, but I think just to take the points that have been made in the room, I think there's Rushworth's point. We need to work with those that are not like ourselves, that are in business, for example, or in regulation, or in slightly different sectors. Even civil society and media don't always work together as well as they could. So we need to work with journalists. We need to work together with human rights defenders. We need to work with governments. And I don't think we always have the same agendas. I think governments often have very narrow stay in power at any cost agendas rather than, but governments are also not homogenous in the same way that Koliwe said civil society is not homogenous. So I think finding those overlapping agendas that Dixon was talking about, that is important. But then I also want to talk about, rule of law. I think for me, this is at the heart of all of this. And it's true that often rights advocacy is very kind of delinked from grassroots. But I think that's also what protects us. It's those frameworks that we can use to hold state actors accountable. There's something very powerful in that basic human rights frameworks that's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international human rights law. And it's the principle of rights holders and duty bearers. Those are very powerful. And rights holders is anyone. You can be an illegal immigrant in South Africa and this government is still responsible and can be held accountable for not protecting your human rights. And I think we don't understand, you talked about how we don't understand our own constitutions, our own national legal frameworks. I think we also don't always understand human rights frameworks, as well as we could have. And I think that's where something like the Declaration becomes important. It's a way for us to do more human rights education. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I think the question is not, do we need the Declaration or not? The question is, how can we be more effective in transforming our environments to achieve more rights-oriented, not just societies, digital frameworks, but social and political context.
So I'm going to get you to end it, Zoe, by saying if you had to bring...
I wasn't originally part of this panel,
I know that.
So I'm giving my 30 seconds to Isa.
Okay. Who would you bring into the room if you were looking at how do we, Henriette's point,
I want to give you a different answer.
I know, that's the problem. You all think that you have to, all of you have talked off point. I get that. I'm going to ask you the question again. Who would you bring into the room? You're answering Rushworth and Telda to a certain extent. In fact, and Gwen, we brought, it has come to that. Who would you bring into that room?
So I think it's obvious who should be in the room. Henriette just gave the list. I agree with that. Can I also say something else? I want to say...
that's exactly you. He will still go and ignore everything you say, but go ahead.
I want to say that if we want AfDec to play the same role in the future on influencing new policy framework development, there needs to be some updates. I'm not saying the declaration, the principles should necessarily be updated. Maybe like Henriette said, maybe it's in the application. But we can't have in the UN Global Principles on Information Integrity a whole new terminology used and not have that somewhere in AfDec.
Right.
We need something about digital public goods, about AI, about access to data, about data rights. That's not in AfDec, right? We need to bring those things in, otherwise we will not be able to influence, to continue to influence to the level that we have up to now. I can stop there or I can continue a bit.
Stop.
Stop, yeah. I have to. No, this is it. No, I have to be strict.
Say something, but I will refrain.
Now, since you're the convener of this, you have the right to.
You gave your right away, but Rihanna's giving it back to you.
Like really 30 seconds. I wanted to tell Gwen this thing, and I'm taking this back to access to information, and talking to people as you were very concerned about this, and this is me wearing my MISA hat from many years ago. After the API Declaration was passed in 2012, what MISA did was to go back and to look at working with different communities. And the one thing that MISA did, and Kuliwe probably hates me for this because I made it do child rights work. For a month in Australia. As MISA worked with child rights organizations and developed a children's charter on access to information. And I think that was groundbreaking, and we need to follow up on that. So, yeah.
Thank you. With that, I know we had a very engaging conversation here. Thank you all. Isaac, Zoe, Koliwe, Henriette. Really appreciate it.